Afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening. Welcome to this webinar on open science and qualitative research. My name is Dr. Sharon Cox, and I'm a Principal Research Fellow in Behavioural Science and Health at UCL, and I'm also Deputy Director of BR UK. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to be joined by three experts in open science and qualitative research. They are Professor Rebecca Campbell from Michigan State University, Dr. Sebastian Karcher from Syracuse University, and Professor Alex Stevens from the University of Sheffield. So the way that we're going to work this afternoon, just a few housekeeping rules, and so you know how it will run. The webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, and it's also being recorded. So if you want to share the link after with people who are unable to attend, but you think it might be of interest to them, then please do. Each speaker will present for around 20 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. The way that we'll work is Sebastian will open the webinar by giving an overview of his work, Open Science Beyond Replication, and a qualitative perspective on open science. Then we'll move to Rebecca's talk, and she will give us an overview of a framework that she's been using and how to work with sensitive qualitative data. And then Alex will introduce himself and a poll, so please do take part in the poll. And then we'll have a short comfort break, and we'll come back and Alex will discuss the poll, and I'll leave that to what that poll is going to be until we come to it, a nice little surprise and to re-energize you. And then there'll be time for questions and answers. So please do put your Q&A in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And there is a function where you can upvote as well. So if there's a question that you particularly want to have answered, then please do upvote that. So I just want to tell you a little bit about why we're doing this. Obviously, qualitative research is an important method. It's an important way that we understand the why and how of many of our quantitative findings. And we held a webinar towards the end of last year on open science, and it, without meaning to be, was quite biased towards quantitative data and not qualitative. And many of the questions that we had is, well, how do we do this for qualitative data? How do we handle sensitive information where you might be working with populations and communities where people are identifiable? And how do you persuade your institute that this data is also as urgent and should be as transparent? And there's also these needs for replication in the same way that we have for other types of data, specifically numeric data. So all of these things are hopefully going to be unpacked today. What I am going to start with is Sebastian. So Sebastian joins us today from the Centre for Qualitative and Multi-Method Inquiry, where he's the director at Syracuse University. So he's also a research associate professor of political science. His main research interests are in research transparency, management and curation of qualitative data, and the interaction of technology and scholarship. So an absolute expert to open up this webinar. And over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Yes, as Sharon mentioned, I'll be trying to sort of set the stage for our discussion and talk a little bit about open science in general and qualitative methods and how it relates to that. So first, you know, what is open science? It's actually a very, very broad spectrum of things. This is one selection. You find others, right? But it ranges from citizen science, then you have open methodology, data, open access, open source software, open educational resources, open peer review, and you can probably find longer lists if you look at them. When we talk about social science, open science, in particular, when we talk about open science in the social sciences, this is the story that we very often hear. And when I review for this, this is often what the first paragraph in a paper reads like. Open science reform largely responds to a realization that standard research practices undermine fundamental principles of high quality in open science, so responds to the replication crisis. And so the first thing that I want to tell you today is this is wrong. Open science predates the replication crisis. Most people date the replication crisis, which really principally as a social psychology with some adjacent social sciences phenomenon, but they date that in about 2011. That's when that paranormal activity article came out, and then the Simonson P-curve stuff came out. And so that's kind of where we usually start this. And I did this very unscientific, dating of open science components using Wikipedia. These are very conservative estimates. I think most of these are older, but they all significantly predate the replication crisis. And I think that's important, not just because we ought to get our history right, but I think the replication crisis as a framing for why we do open science is quite off-putting for us as qualitative researchers, because most of us are not engaged in the business of replication, and it's not our crisis in the first place. So if that's why we do open science, why should we care? Well, we care about open science for a whole host of other reasons, and that's why people have been doing this not just for the last 15 years, but really for the last almost 40 years. I would also argue that there is some places where we're actually quite strong in qualitative research already. These are my personal assessments, but when we think about citizen science, right, like community engaged research, having our participants be part of a research project, way ahead of anything that quantitative social science does. The idea of co-creation with participants is really something that qualitative researchers have embraced for quite some time, are embracing more strongly now, and I think we ought to be self-confident about our strength in open science. I also, and this might be a bit more controversial, I think in parts of open methodology, we actually are much more careful than some of our quantitative colleagues. So if I look, for example, at ethnography, there's often a very detailed description of how a researcher entered the field. I was just reading Anne LaRose's masterful classic Unequal Childhoods, and she goes to great length to describe all the things that went wrong and her setbacks and all those things. So really in-depth understanding of what happened during data collection, not just kind of like the nice glossy, I took a random sample of 1,500 people, sure, but how, right? But a lot of detail and precision there. So we ought to be proud of that and build on that strengths. Then there are parts of open science that I would argue just equally apply to qualitative and quantitative research, we shouldn't feel they apply less to us as qualitative researchers. Open access, open peer review, open educational resources are certainly part of that. And then there are parts where quantitative research has made more advances for various reasons that we can discuss. I would say open data, that Rebecca is going to talk about more, is one of those areas. I would argue open methodology in data analysis is another one of those areas. Quantitative researchers now routinely share their analysis code, which gives you high levels of insight in what actually happened during data analysis. Oddly, or I think with less of a good reason, open source software. A lot of quantitative research now happens entirely on open source platforms, R for statistics, Python for statistics. To the extent that qualitative researchers use software in vivo, Atlas, Deduce, none of these are open source, although we do see some promising signs. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to talk about a subsection of open science that I like to call research transparency. So that focuses about open methodologies and open data in particular. So first, I want to highlight a little bit this distinction between reproducibility and transparency. In open science discussions, we often focus on reproducibility, and I don't think reproducibility, so using the same data and the same methods to get the same results, is particularly interesting for qualitative researchers. If you have a strong, this is my amateur philosophy of science slide. It's only one, if you will excuse me for this. If you have a strong positivist agenda, right, you really believe in discovering universal laws, the scientific method essentially emulating the natural sciences and how we conduct social sciences. You do want reproducibility. The same exact thing should happen all the time. Most of us who do qualitative research believe that some version of interpretation, understanding, what Weber called Verstehen, plays a role in this. And for example, the person of the researcher conducting the research plays a role in what we find. And so, for example, if Rebecca and I conduct the same research, we are going to get different results. So we don't expect full reproducibility, but I would argue it's still highly desirable to do good science, to be transparent, so to allow other people to see precisely what I did to get the results that I obtained. Similarly, qualitative research is often used earlier on in the research cycle, if you want. This is a line, but you can test the theory, testing again to exploration to earth theory, refining, and then you've got a cycle. And when you do hardcore theory testing, right, you have kind of your standard hypothesis test, H1, H null, and then you test. You probably want to be able to replicate that, because without some level of the ability to try the same thing again and get the same results, the idea of hypothesis testing makes much less sense. But in all the other parts of the research cycle, the hypothesis generation, your theory building, where qualitative research often is particularly strong, replication doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, how do you replicate coming up with a hypothesis? That said, it's not like this part of the research is some sort of black box where we just poke around with sticks and then don't know what's going on. We still ought to do it carefully. We still ought to do it following rules and allow other people to see which rules we follow. So we still ought to do this transparently. So let me get into kind of how I think about this for qualitative research. I roughly think about the research process, and this is, simplified as kind of three parts that we want to be transparent about. Production transparency, how are the data collected or generated? Data access, so can I actually see the data? And then how are the data analyzed? I will note here again, reproducibility, or sometimes computational reproducibility for quantitative research, is you give someone the data set that you use, you give someone the computer code that you used, and then you reproduce the exact tables and figures that you have in the manuscript. But that reproducibility is really just a side effect of the quantitative researcher being highly transparent about that particular aspect of their research. So let me run through these quickly, and I'm going to go through data access, which is particularly close to my heart, fairly quickly because Rebecca is going to talk about it at great length. The big topic when we talk about sharing data are ethical concerns. One of the reasons we collect qualitative data is that they're really rich. The other reason is that it often allows us to get at types of information that quantitative data doesn't capture. So we need to be very careful about the ethics of handling that data. That does mean we need to collect informed consent, and informed consent not just about what the study contains, but also what you're doing with the data. And so if you're going to share it, you need to talk about this. And I note here, and I'll kind of gloss over this brief quickly, but there are some underlying differences in qualitative and quantitative research that make some of this genuinely harder. So the concerns that you'll hear from qualitative researchers about sharing their data are real concerns, and you'll see some of the difficulties, but also potential ways forward when Rebecca talks about this more. I did want to give you an example of how colleagues of mine have asked for consent for data sharing. So what they did is they built in a tiered consent. So you opted into the study and you separately opted into consent to data sharing. This was a study on abortion. Cognitive interviews, so not super sensitive, but quite sensitive. And uh, they then asked an optional consent to data sharing. And one of the striking findings we got when we wrote this up is that almost all of the participants, these were US women, half of whom had had an abortion, opted into data sharing. There are more details in that study if you want to read up on it, but a striking finding. The second part is about de-identifying qualitative data. Again, very quickly, one of the things that I want to highlight is that it often requires contextual knowledge. In this case, I purposefully put up a Spanish transcript, so that's the first type of context that you need to know, but you also need to know what sorts of details are actually going to be potentially identifying because they only apply to few people, or they're very private knowledge that anyone could use to lead you back to a participant, all those sorts of things that make it harder. It's also fairly hard to automate. There's certainly people working on semi-automated solutions with AI or machine learning based technologies, but as of today, there are no automated ways to de-identify qualitative research, which means it takes a good amount of time if you want to de-identify your, I'm thinking here, interview or focus group transcripts before sharing them. If you do want to share them, there are excellent resources. There's the qualitative data repository that I direct in the US. The UK Data Service has actually been doing this longer than anyone else in the world, and has the largest collection of shared qualitative data in the world. So if you are in the UK, as I assume most of you are, you're in really good hands here. ICPSR is another repository that does mainly quantitative data, but has a large holding of qualitative data. And working with the repository gives you a whole bunch of advantages. We're in the business of keeping your data safe for the long term. We also do this thing called FAIR, that's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. So we follow best standards for making data available so that it can be found and that other people can actively use it. All these three services, not necessarily all data repositories engage in curation. So we look at the data, we check for disclosure risk before we get it. We look, are there maybe copyright issues with your data? We help you think through documentation and metadata. We help you think through organization. And importantly, for a lot of qualitative data, we help you think about access controls. There's various ways to think about access controls, right? There's this idea among many people, when I share my data, I have to share it with everyone under every condition. And that's very much not true. And it's definitely not true for a lot of qualitative data. The European Union has this nice phrase, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And I think that's very helpful, right? So when you have something that's completely non-sensitive, make it easy to use. But then think about other ways how you can protect sensitive data. So you can have a subset that's mainly public. You can put an embargo on data, so maybe people can access it in 3 or 10 or even 100 years. You can require specific applications for data access. That's often helpful. For example, if you want to make sure that people don't use publish data to snoop on their neighbor, or if you did workplace research, that the bosses don't go after their workers who participated in research, those types of things. And there are also technical means to further protect the data. They're called enclaves or virtual enclaves, where the data never leaves the server at the data repository. I want to end the part about data sharing to point out not all data can or should be shared, and certainly not all qualitative data can or should be shared. If you don't have consent for sharing and you can't go back to ask consent, or people don't want to consent for data sharing, you shouldn't share your data. Sometimes de-identification isn't possible. I am a political scientist, as Sharon mentioned in the beginning. elite interviews are often extremely hard and sometimes impossible to de-identify, because what makes them elite interviews is that they're a small group, they have very specific knowledge. So as they talk about something, they'd be easy to de-identify. You can also run into situations where data sharing might decrease the quality of your research. So if you get the sense that people might still want to participate, but will tell you different things as you talk about, okay, I'll share your data, that's a problem. This isn't all or nothing, right? You can share a subset of the data. We have a case, for example, where someone did research on judges in France. They shared the data from the lower court judges because there are many of them. They didn't share their interviews with the highest court judges because there are few of them that would have been easy to re-identify. But even if you don't share your data, you can still do open science. You can still do transparent research. And I'm just going to very quickly just give you a menu of options, how I think about this. I want to be very clear. This really is a menu. You can kind of pick and choose what works for you, and you shouldn't feel like you need to do all or even many of these things to do good open science. One thing that I've seen grow is qualitative pre-registration. Pre-registration, big deal in experimental quantitative research. But we are seeing increased example in qualitative research. And one of the nice things that helps you do is very explicit about what you're planning to do, and think about this very carefully beforehand. There is a template, there's an article by Tamara and Haven and co-authors, and there's a template at OSF that you can use. It gives you kind of different advantages to pre-registration in quant, right? You're not going to p-hack in qualitative research because that's not a thing. So that kind of advantage it doesn't confer onto you, but it does help you to kind of do very carefully described procedures. Another thing that I've been working on with a colleague is a transparency checklist. So essentially a whole list of documents that you collect during the research process, and thinking actively, okay, can I share this? Will this help transparency? So things like the documents, interview instruments, focus group instruments, recruitment instruments, informed consent on the front end, but then also what did I use during analysis, kind of the different analysis steps. A subset of this is a tool that I like a lot that's called an interview method appendix, where you kind of have a list of all your interviews with some information about them. This is specifically designed for elite interviews, but you can absolutely adapt this for non-elite interviews. And then, of course, there is your general methods appendix. Ethnographers tend to do very well with this. Other qualitative researchers, not as well. And we don't have standards that are as good as I'd like them to be. But I do want to encourage you to use your appendix to be transparent to a fault in some sense, because you have plenty of space in an appendix in about your data collection procedures. And then finally, analytic transparency. So how do I talk about analysis methods? That really does depend on your methods. And I should flag here, in a lot of qualitative methods, this distinction between data collection and analysis is a lot more fluid, thinking about, say, grounded theory or so. But, you know, as an abstraction may still help us to think about this. One thing that we've talked about is if you do kind of case study research and you want to link underlying data to claims, so this is historical-based case study research. One thing that we've worked on is technology and methods to overlay kind of a digital layer where you highlight a claim in the article, you click on it, it pops us this annotation that provides additional context and then links directly to the underlying data source, here, the historical document. So you don't actually have to go, in this case, to the British Archives, but you can find the document directly. More transparency. there's the data underlying your computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, right? You've done all your coding, you have your memos. There is now an open exchange format that's great for sharing that information to the extent that you can. So another way that you can be more transparent. And oh, that was just in the wrong order. That is, very quickly some pointers to how you can get started with more open science and qualitative research. I hope we are sharing these slides. Otherwise, take a screenshot. I tried to put a whole bunch of resources together with my contact information on here.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. That was an excellent presentation and so much to unpack, and the questions are starting to come in. We'll get to those after everybody has spoken. And that transparency checklist is something that I'll be using. I didn't know about that, and so many great resources there. We can share your slides, and as I said before, this is being recorded, so people can come back to that slide even via the pre-record. Right, so next we have Professor Rebecca Campbell, who's a Professor of Ecological Community Psychology at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on violence against women and children with an emphasis on sexual assault. Professor Campbell studies sexual assault survivors' help-seeking experiences with the legal, medical and mental health systems, and how community and campus systems address survivors' needs. So I'm sure you can appreciate this is very sensitive work that she's doing, and this makes her an absolute expert to talk to us today about sharing sensitive qualitative data. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Sharon said, my name is Rebecca Campbell. I use she, her pronouns, and I come to you from Michigan State University over in the US. So as Sharon said, I will be talking about the step of sharing data. So after a study, qualitative study has been completed, the idea is to prepare the data to share with others. So just very briefly about me and how I position my work. I'm a community psychologist. Everything I do is field-based. I do participatory action research, so I'm often working with practitioners as well as survivors and co-developing the study. Most of my work is mixed methods with very, very strong qualitative components, both ethnography and interview, though today I'll be talking exclusively about interviews. And as Sharon noted, the population that I work with are sexual assault survivors. So in my circles, in this sort of world, open science really wasn't on my radar screen. I honestly thought about it very much in the way that Sebastian just talked about. It's like, well, it's a problem for my social psychologists who do lab research, hypothesis testing. They're having a replication crisis. Meanwhile, I'm just living my life and living it well, quite frankly. And then things sort of changed for me. I was open-minded about this. I believe in transparency. I have shared my quantitative data, but I honestly felt no urgency, no immediacy about this until I received a US federal grant several years ago from the US Department of Justice that had a requirement that I would archive de-identified qualitative data in an established data repository. It's a requirement of the grant. And the specific archive is the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data. And it's one of the subsets of one of the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research that Sebastian talked about. So it's one of the larger US-based data archives. Primarily quantitative, but growing its holdings in qualitative work. Some data sets are fully open. Some require application, review, and vetting before they're released. And that's the space that we were going to be archiving our data. So let me tell you a little bit very briefly about this study that we had to archive the ultimate data in. It was qualitative interviews with sexual assault survivors in Detroit, Michigan. The location that this study was done was public information, and it was released by my funder. So I could not I started off sort of behind the proverbial 8 ball of like, everybody knows where I'm doing this. If you want to file public records requests in Michigan, you know exactly where to go and you know exactly where to find them. So that was challenging. It was also challenging because the focus of the research would involve asking survivors to recount what happened to them in the assault itself and how they were treated by law enforcement, the Detroit Police Department, when they reported, and then ultimately also how they were treated and what happened in the eventual criminal prosecution of their cases. So given this, I was worried. I was really, really worried. And I was worried about a lot of things. I was worried, as I always am in my qualitative research with this population, about first and foremost creating a safe and trauma-informed environment for my survivor colleagues. Secondly, I was very concerned about protecting their privacy and confidentiality. And specifically, given that I had this mandate to share the data in this archive, I was very, very worried about preventing the re-identification. Meaning somebody could look at this transcript and say, oh, I think I know who this is. Or if I do a public records request, I bet I can figure out who this is and what this case is. So many things I'm worried about. This is the worry I want to talk about in today's webinar, is preventing the re-identification of the data and how we prepared the data for archiving. All of these details are shared in this specific publication. What I want to do today is sort of hit some highlights, as well as a little bit more of the behind the scenes that didn't make it into this paper about what we were worried about and how we did what we did. So I want to start at before the beginning, which is actually at the end, which doesn't make any sense, but it will in a moment. So it's at the end of the study. I did not prepare for this along the way. That is, without a doubt, the biggest lesson learned. I didn't know Sebastian when I started this project. I didn't think about documenting stuff along the way. I'm just going about my merry life. And honestly, just being like, yeah, we'll deal with archiving at the end. So we had already done the whole study. I did make a couple of changes in how we did the study to prepare for this. And the big one we did was the informed consent for data archiving, which again was Sebastian highlighted as a core thing. But we didn't really have a great model for how to do this in a trauma-informed way. We had read some of the prior studies, but we really felt like we needed a little bit more sort of around a trauma-informed approach to this. And again, there's an article we did on doing this. So this is the script. And again, you'll see these slides, so you don't need to absorb all of it right now. So we tell them we are required to share de-identified data. We promise we will remove your name, anyone else's name, dates, and then any other details about your case that would be identifiable, which turned out to be a very easy sentence to say and something that became very hard in practice to bring to fruition. The other thing we did, which we thought was really kind of the unique trauma-informed part, was at the end of our interviews with the survivors, we said, we're going to give you a chance at the end of the interview, after you've already told everything, after you've talked about it, to make a decision at that point to say, you know what, remember when I was talking about this, that, or the other? I don't want that shared. I don't want that archived. When I was talking about no questions asked, we agreed to remove it. So that's the trauma-informed point. Trauma-informed is about giving people choice and control. We gave them control over the data and let them remove things before they would be archived. So that was our approach. We went about data collection. We interviewed 32 survivors. All of them agreed to data archiving. So again, sort of replicating the study that, or in principle, what Sebastian was covering. We did not find any suggestion that they were withholding because they knew it was going to be archiving. The data were very rich. The detail, the narratives were really honestly heartbreaking. They were awful. As part of that, we asked them, how do you feel about this idea of data sharing? And they were incredibly positive about it. They said, we want more people to know about what's happening. We want other researchers to learn from our experiences. And at the end of the interviews, when we said, is there anything you want to take out? Only 2 participants said they wanted something taken out, and they were not substantive. They just said, please remove the profanity. I'm a woman of God, and I lost my moment here and there. So we're like, okay, we'll remove the profanity, but they took nothing substantive out. So our lesson learned from this sort of phase 0 is that informed consent for data archiving is absolutely possible, and it can be incredibly well received. So now we begin phase 1, which again is at the end of the study. We've collected the data, we've done all the substantive analyses, our team is exhausted, and now we have a whole new thing that we need to do, which is to begin to prepare our data for archiving. So where we needed to start was figuring out what is the process we are going to follow for identifying what needs to be de-identified. We turned to and looked for a lot of guidance on this. At the 50,000 foot view was our IRB, which was not helpful because basically all they said was do what your consent form said you would do. We got a little bit more helpful guidance from the archiving guidelines of the specific archive in the US we needed to submit to. We got much more help from Sebastian's materials with the Qualitative Data Repository Curation Handbook. And then at the ground level, there are other studies in the published literature. So we could like pull up studies and like look at more examples of like, how did you do blurring? How did you do this? But the problem is even at the ground level guidance, we were not there. We were deep underground. We were at the roots. We were buried. We were worried. We were stressed out. And we kept going over and over in our mind this, any other details about your case that could be identifiable? Because it seemed like, my gosh, anything could be re-identifiable. And we felt buried and we felt trapped and we felt like there was no way out. So the lesson we learned in this moment of existential panic was is that you need not only methodological guidance, but you need subject matter guidance too. So you need to talk to people. We needed to talk to people who really understood the subject matter of our data, because they could really look at it and say, that is a risk, that's a risk. So in our project, it was victim service agency staff and the prosecutors. Could have been the survivors. We can talk about that later, but we didn't have really a way to reconnect with them at this phase. But we could always go back to our colleagues in the victim service agency and the prosecutors. So we engaged them in a couple of sort of working meetings, and we said, listen, we've got this transcript, and in this transcript, we have all of this information. So each of these little dots is like a sentence or a paragraph or something, and we're worried that it could be re-identified. And so now you'll see the prosecutorial focus, because they're like, okay, so each of these dots, you need to know who else has that information, how they know that, and what other records contain that. So again, you see the who, what, where, when, why of the legal system. But it turned out that was a really useful lens, because we're like, oh, who else would know this information? Well, the perpetrator might know it, a family or friend might know it, the detective might know it. How would they know it? Well, they know it because they're the one who did it, because they took the victim's report. And what other records would have that information that could then be paired with our transcript potentially and create a re-identification risk? Okay, that's going to be in the police report. That's going to be in the court transcript. So we could look at each dot that we would pull out of the unredacted raw interview and ask ourselves, who knows this? How do they know it? And what other records contain this specific data point? And then data point by data point, we could remediate it. We could say we could retain it because the risk is very low. We could remediate it, usually through some type of blurring so that it wouldn't be quite as connected. Or, as Sebastian said, sometimes you just can't share it. We would just redact it. And we would go through this process over and over again until we would end up with a remediated transcript, which by design does not look like the original transcript. You can't do everything with it, but hopefully we have retained enough information that it would have value as a secondary data set for other researchers. So that was the process that we outlined. And so then the next phase was to implement that process and remediate our data. So we approach this as a type of coding in its own right. So we assembled a team. Each member would read the transcripts. We just use Microsoft Word. So we would, highlight text and use a comment box. And in the comment box, we would say, this needs to be remediated. And they would propose a strategy, change this to this. And then we would review and re-review each transcript, each comment box to come up with an agreed upon plan for how to remediate. So now I want to share with you some examples of how we did this. So names is a pretty easy one. It wouldn't be uncommon that survivors would name their friends, the service providers, the perpetrator. Easy to find, easy to blur. So we would just replace the name with what the role was, perpetrator or detective number one. There were some times where we had to blur a little bit more, a little further. So survivors often talked about their mothers and how their mothers responded to knowing that their daughters had been sexually assaulted. Sometimes that would trigger the mother to respond and disclose her own assault. So if we left the label as mother, we kind of left the mother a little bit exposed. So we blurred a little further to just family member. So secondary users would know there was a family member who had been also assaulted and the like, but they didn't know it was the mother specifically. And we felt that was a reasonable trade-off in protecting privacy, but also preserving some of the richness of the data. Dates also definitely had to be redacted because that is all over other records. It's in the police report, it's in the court report, so dates had to go. But the time interval was often something that survivors talked about, how bloody long it took their cases to be prosecuted. So we wanted to retain that. So instead of giving dates, we would insert the time interval, 3 months, 3 years, 10 years, 15 years. That way, secondary users really had a sense for how long this took, but without giving the start and end dates, which would then give them an anchor point for finding other records. Perhaps the most difficult thing that we had to deal with was the actual story of the assault. The survivors told what happened to them in their own words. And our first attempt was to remediate by blurring. So that same sort of thing of changing specific details, making them more generalized. And in one of our team meetings, one of our coders said, I feel like I'm rewriting her story, and that doesn't feel okay. And like immediately everybody on Zoom starts nodding. And it's like, okay, we've hit on something. We felt deeply uncomfortable sort of in a word by word, sentence by sentence, trying to blur this. The story is the story. It belongs to the survivors. So we went back to the prosecutors, we went back to the victim service providers. We're like, help, what do we do here? And it was the service providers that said, if you're uncomfortable with tinkering with the story, then just be honest that you are inserting a summary of the story and you're not changing and trying to blur the story. And we're like, oh, that makes sense. So we captured the story and we wrote a summary of key variables, if you will, that secondary users would probably want to know about, but we took out everything else. So we owned our decision to not change the story, but to preserve it and protect it and leave it private, but to provide a summary of key elements of the assault for secondary users. We also thought we were going to have a lot of trouble with the text regarding their experiences with the legal system. So again, we started the same way with trying to remediate by blurring, changing words, making it more generalized. And again, in one of our team meetings, one of the coders said, well, like, how identifiable is this? I mean, it seems like the survivors are having the same experience over and over again. And again, everybody starts nodding on Zoom. So we pulled that section of the transcripts, their experiences with legal system, all 32, we glued it all together. We read it front to back, and holy cow, it wasn't identifiable. It was like 32 people having the same awful experience over and over again. So in this particular study, in this particular data set, this information was not identifiable. It was virtually interchangeable across the cases. That may not be true in all, but in this one, it was so ubiquitous. So we were able to retain it with very minimal blurring. So you can see the words there, garbage, whore. That was not specific to this interview or the other interviews. It was really, really common. So we could retain the actual words and the richness and the pain of these words because it was happening over and over again across this data set. So what we learned from this is that remediation is very time and labor and intensive. And there's a lot of emotional wear and tear on the staff to do this, to keep reading this over and over again and trying to come up with a good plan, sort of dot by dot, sentence by sentence. So then the last phase was thinking about the quality of our work and trying to be, thoughtful about this, because we started with an original transcript. We ended with something that was remediated, and a lot happened in between here and there. And we were trying to be transparent and share with the world how we did that. But we learned this was really a very deliberative decision-making process. It was a form of analysis in its own right. So after we had done the substantive analysis, we then had this methodological analysis. And in any time you do analysis and qualitative work, you need some type of validity check. So again, at this stage, we're like, I don't know. We went back to Canon. We went back to Lincoln and Guba. Whether that was a good choice or a bad choice, I don't know, but it was a choice we made. And it was really the credibility piece, confidence in the accuracy of our findings. And accuracy was something we spun our wheels about, like, what does that mean? And we operationalized it as, could the data be re-identified? And the people who we thought would be most likely to re-identify the data would be those victim agency staff, because they had worked with these survivors. They had been with them in court. They had been through every single stage. So we gave them back a subset of our transcripts that we had remediated and kind of crossed our fingers and said, can you re-identify this? Can you tell me who this is? And they could not. We had stripped away enough of the specifics and left enough of the ubiquitous. They're like, you know what? This is like a day in the office. I can't tell you which one it is, but this is what the survivors experienced. So we said, whew. So a few points of reflection of going through this journey. We often asked over and over, what can be automated? And as Sebastian said, there's no great option there, but there is development and advances there. And whatever could be automated, by golly, we wish we had it, because there is still a lot that has to be reviewed by people. And we wondered, how can we bring the community stakeholders in and potentially the participants more? Our community stakeholders were amazing. They were wonderful and really helping us think through the content of the data and the specific risks. We did not engage the survivors because we didn't think ahead to ask them not only for informed consent to the interview, informed consent to data archiving, but to re-engage with us in this process. And I think that's something we're going to try in a study we're planning now, is to see if they might want to work with us on this process. So I started this process sort of thinking that open science was really kind of for the other people, and then really came to learn that there was a lot in it for me and the kind of work that I do, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need very tailored, very customized and contextualized approaches that really address the type of research and the specific population, because the risks are relative. And we need to always be thinking about, what are the risks for this study and this population? So I thank you for your time and attention on that. There's my email, and I will turn it back over to Sharon now.
Thank you so much. What a masterclass. And I learned so much. I think we can take away and digest. And everything you touched on are things that I thought about. A lot of my work, for those of you that don't know, is around people experiencing homelessness, and people can reveal some very sensitive pieces of information. And because the groups that I work with are understudied, I want to make my work available to people beyond just the academic paper, which is really just a snapshot. So some of the things that you've advised us on there are things I can bring into my own work, and I'm sure many people will. So thank you so much. So now, last but not least, we're going to get Alex Stevens in two parts. Professor Stevens is currently chair in criminology, and he is also School of Law and acting director for the Centre for Criminological Research at the University of Sheffield. Before joining the University of Sheffield, he worked for 26 years at the University of Kent, that's how I know Alex, where he was appointed Professor of Criminal Justice in the Kent Law School. Alex's research and teaching focuses on the overlap between drugs, crime and public health. He is particularly interested in how policies in these areas are made and how they can be improved through research and collaboration with policymakers, practitioners and directly affected communities. And again, somebody that is a jobbing researcher that is trying to make work much more open and transparent for greater use. So Alex, over to you for part one, and then we're going to have a short break and then come back for part two, but part one now.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Thanks to you and to Behavioural Research UK for inviting me to speak in this webinar. I've already learned so much. I'm especially grateful given that I am neither a behavioural researcher, I'm a criminologist, I suppose that's on the borderline, nor an expert in methods of open science. I am, as you say, Sharon, a jobbing researcher, mixed methods researcher, trying to think about how to make science both quantitative and qualitative more open. My motivation for this is going back, as Sebastian said, many years before other people had a replication crisis, to thinking about how we can take back control of the means of academic production. How can we, as academics, students, and people that we work with, like the partners that Rebecca was doing her valuable work with, how can we actually own, share the data and the findings we do, and not give it over into some private garden where shareholders can turn it into profit by keeping people out. And my sort of light bulb moment, I suppose, was when I was talking to somebody who's involved in investigating money laundering in the Mexican drug business. And he told me that the maximum threshold of profit that they look for is if anyone's making a profit margin over 12%, then they'll be investigative of money laundering. The next day I saw Elsevier's annual report. Their profit margin on taking our work for free and selling it back to us expensively was at that stage about 37%. I thought, why are we doing this? Why are we participating in this racket that is lining other people's pockets rather than being used to create and share knowledge? So that's my motivation. And what I'm going to do in the sort of second part is talk about what I think are the easy things, what I think are the harder things, and what I think are the things that are easy but perhaps career threatening, and what our responsibilities are, especially as senior researchers, with those things. But one of the easiest things we can do is share our publications through open access. And one of the easiest ways to do that is if you have a rights retention policy in your university or institution that enables you to put a statement on your publications when you submit them the first time to publication that states you will be sharing them through Creative Commons. So we're about to have a break. What I'd like you to do is to fill in the poll that a colleague from BR UK is just about to put up there. Does your university or institute have a rights retention policy that enables you to share the author accepted version of your journal article open access as soon as they are published? Now, this is not a test. It's not you're actually encouraged to cheat. If you don't know, find out. Or maybe it's interesting if you don't know. We as a group of people speaking here, I hope you as a group of people out there in the world trying to do open access publishing as well as open research are interested to know whether there's this availability across the sector to do open publication through rights retention. So we'll leave that there. For how long are we having a break for, Sharon?
So yes, so if we come back on the hour, that's 4 o'clock for those of us in the UK, but on the hour should be for everybody. So 5-6 minute break, comfort break, and then we'll come back, and we've already got people answering, responding to the poll. So we'll talk about that and come back for part 2. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody, and I'll hand back over to Alex to discuss the results, if you like, the indications that we've got from the poll, and to go on from there, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Sharon. I think this is a fascinating result. I should thank my colleague Jenny Adams at the University of Sheffield Library, because until a few months ago, I didn't know that we had a rights retention policy. So I didn't know quite how easy it was to just put a statement on and wherever I was publishing. And I've just worked 2 or 3 times already that I've just been able to share the results of my knowledge creation with my colleagues without having to jump any hurdles. The publishers have accepted it. The fact that 2/3 of us on this call don't know whether we have access to that really easy way of making our knowledge public is really interesting. I would encourage you to try and find out. And if the answer comes back like for 5% of people that it's no, then maybe to try and encourage your colleagues who have the power to do so to create a rights retention policy for your institution. This is because I think this is sort of the baseline. I said I'd talk about the easy things, the harder things, and maybe the career challenging things that we can do for open science as qualitative researchers. And I think publishing open access is the very basic, especially as we're made to do it by the Research Excellence Framework. Might not apply to Sebastian and Rebecca, but the rest of those of us who are in the UK have to worry about these things. And rights retention is a really very good way of doing it. Another really easy thing I think we can all do to support open science is to not work for free for Elsevier. I'm naming Elsevier because I think they are the most egregious example, not only in the rapaciousness of their attempt to protect their monopoly on knowledge production, they also provide an absolutely awful service to editors, reviewers, and journal submitters by their constant attempts to cut costs and shift the work to automatic or offshore sources. So let's not do any work for Elsevier if we can avoid it. If we're talking a bit more about the open science stuff, I think the idea of making our processes more transparent. Jenny, my colleague, recently introduced me to the idea of data papers in data journals, which is similar to what Sebastian was saying about using the appendices that we have lots of space in to document our research process, perhaps a bit more publicly if we actually get them published in data journals than making people squirrel away in our footnotes for finding where to get the appendix. And then we can also think about open data access. Now, I think a lot of qualitative researchers, I certainly thought we throw our hands up in horror at the idea because it's so difficult and can be so difficult. Rebecca, I'm so full of admiration for the patience and meticulous work you've done with such an important thing to do. But it's not always that hard because many of us as qualitative researchers do projects on data which is pretty much already open. A lot of my research, for example, is on policy analysis. Those policy documents are at least semi-open, and we can make them more open without challenging anyone's ethics. Quite a lot of the policy analysis research I read doesn't really allow you to find what the sources are, even though the sources were open access in the first place. So the least we could do is publish an appendix somewhere that lists or provides those discourse documents for people to look at again if they need to. There's no problems with the identification there. I'm quite interested in the whole idea of pre-registration of qualitative research. It's easy to do. I've done it with a couple of projects. I'm not entirely convinced, and Sebastian might be able to convince me, that it is appropriate for qualitative research, because qualitative research is a creative process that develops as we're doing the analysis sometimes, many times, and it's quite hard to pre-register that. So I'm sort of on the borderline with pre-registration of qualitative research, even though I have done it myself. Those are the things. I mean, pre-registration is quite an easy thing to do, though, because you've got a research plan. You've probably had to write it to get the money. So why not publish it? The harder things to do, I think, are sharing qualitative data. The work you're doing, Rebecca, fantastic. And I think the really important point Rebecca made, one of the many really important points that Rebecca made, was that people want their stories to be shared. That's why they're telling us. That's why they agree to be interviewed. And we're doing them a disservice if we hide that data away for our own private use and never share it. So the work that Rebecca's and her colleagues are doing I think is fantastic. But it also made me think of many qualitative research projects that I've worked on, where we've struggled to produce the reports by the deadline, let alone then have another period of time where we do all that meticulous and careful work to de-identify all this stuff. So, you know, a lot of the research we do as qualitative research is not even funded. Many of us are fitting it into the cracks between teaching and other responsibilities. We don't have teams who can work on de-identification. So it does make it really hard to do good open science around data sharing and coding as well. So Sebastian, talking about the annotations, to be honest with you, my NVivo files are a complete mess. And it would be very, very difficult indeed for anyone to make any more tailor them, especially when I'm doing them on my own. When I'm doing a collaborative, we have to keep a bit of order. But the ones I've done myself, you know, it would be very hard indeed. And it would take me a long time to make them comprehensible to people. So these are quite hard things to do, even if they are valuable. But I think the most interesting thing to discuss perhaps is the things that's easy to do, but perhaps a bit threatening for your career. So what about, you know, publishing in diamond open access journals, or deliberately targeting journals which support open access that are not perhaps as prestigious as the journals that you want to get into because you'll be able to say them on your CV, or because you know there's a halo effect when it comes to the ref, that if you're published in a high impact factor journal, you're more likely to come up, be rated as 3-star or 4-star in that exercise. I think we need to recognize that risk exists, it is real, and especially it affects people who are at the earlier stages of their career. So this is why I would call on people who are at my end of their careers, professors and above, people who don't have to worry really about where the next paycheck is coming, especially if they're in an institution which is not at the sharp end of the current financial crisis in UK universities. I think it falls to us to take a lead in this and be the ones who say, yes, I'm going to put some of my best work in diamond open access journals. And I don't really care if people read my CV and think, oh, what's that? You know, I'm putting it there because that's the right journal, and it's making the space for that journal to be read by everyone, but also setting an example to the field that the best work can be open access as well as based on open science. So most of all, I want to thank Sebastian and Rebecca for 2 fascinating presentations from which we will learn so much. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, and very thought-provoking as always, Alex. That's part of the reason why I was so keen to have you, because you've always got incredible insights into the broader ethics around the way that we work as researchers or users of research. So thank you. So we do have quite a number of questions, and I will be chairing the questions now. Please do carry on putting them in. Sometimes I don't know how long it will take for us to get through the ones that we've got so far. But anyway, we'll start with this one here. It's a question from Benjamin. The question Sharon raised at the start, raised by qualitative researchers in a previous event, mostly related to the hows of open data and open science. Do any of the panelists think that there are distinctive whys for openness within qualitative methodological and ethical traditions, meaning rationales for openness, than we find from the quantitative social sciences and other quant disciplines? It seems from Sebastian's presentation, so maybe Sebastian, you can take this question first, presentation, that the rationales relating to replicability do not always travel.
Yeah, so I think I can think of 3 to 4. So I'm going to start with the one that Alex mentions, right? And that's perhaps the most uniquely qual, which is giving more of a voice to participants. And participants care about this to very different degrees. But having not just the potential to maybe have like 1 sentence of your 1-hour interview or 3-hour interview appear in a publication, but actually having the whole thing there and having it preserved for the long term and having it potentially used by other researchers, I think that is a real motivation. And I think sometimes as people doing qualitative work, we tend to underestimate how much participants are in it to help, both to help science, but also to have a voice. So that I think is stronger for qual. There are 3 others that I think roughly apply equally. One is teaching at QDR, and I know at UK Data. The biggest demand for shared qualitative data we have is for teaching. And that has been so incredibly successful for quantitative methods classes that people just go in and analyze study data, reanalyze study data. It's not quite the same for qual, right? Because as there is more kind of going back and forth between collection and analysis and qualitative research. So it's not a perfect analogy, but if you want to, for example, learn how to code data, how to do content analysis, how maybe content analysis is different from thematic analysis, not working with a faux data set, but working with real data, potentially even data that interests you personally, amazing. Secondly, I do think transparency matters, right? I think exposing ourselves to people looking more closely at the data and saying, well, you quoted that one bit, but really, if you read the interview around it, that's not really what this was about. Both is important for scientific integrity, but having done some meta studies on people doing this also makes you do better work, right? If you know that people can look like that, you will make sure that if they do, they won't find your dirty laundry or whatever you don't want to be found. And the third thing is reuse does exist, and there's actually a sizable literature on secondary use of qualitative data, particularly coming out of the UK context. Janet Healy has written about this at length. Florian Kern in Political Science has just started a project on this. And I think for all sorts of reasons, like better science, more, building on the work of other people, all those sorts of things, we should be doing more of this. So those are my four, why, and this is research transparency. There is like the other parts of open science that I want also again, but they all have their own justifications too.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sebastian. Comprehensive answer. Rebecca or Alex, do you have anything to add to that or move to another question? Yeah, Alex?
Just one more, which is more specific to qualitative researchers, because as Rebecca mentioned, we tend to believe more and try and do more of co-creation of research, and making this data available to people enables people to get more involved in the production of analysis rather than keeping it behind walls in the academe. So that's just another more qualitative specific reason for making things open.
Yeah. On that point, and Alex, to your point about making protocols available, I have actually made protocols available for qualitative research, including the steps that where I'm going to involve patients and the public, because I think that some people who want to do better PPI or or public engagement, however you want to call it, they're not, when they're new to it, they're not sure of the steps. So I think there's so much within the research journey that's not just data, but actually how we do the research that we can make open. We're all a bit cloak and dagger about how we do it. We produce these nice papers at the end, but there's been a whole series of events. So I think there are lots of different things that we can make open access. Other questions that are coming in, I do want to just quickly go to one that was, well, not quickly, and take our time, but one that was sent in advance, not to disadvantage the people that can't make it in real time because, they might have other responsibilities at this time. But, and this is something I hear quite a lot. So, Alex or Rebecca, if you would like to go first on this, but how to navigate between the need for transparency and the potential restraint that might come with publishing interview schedules. Maybe Rebecca, you could start with that, because from the work that you've done, how can we incentivize people that, that everyone's really pushed for time? So what would you suggest?
Everyone is pushed for time. And the mistake that I made in my project was putting it all at the end. And I would not do that again. I would really do a lot more along the way, because I made more work for myself and my team undoubtedly by sticking my head in the sand until the very last moment, until I had to do this. So I think that it is possible to make this less laborious and less time intensive, that while you're doing your coding, You're also working on preparing your data for sharing and archiving and the like. We did ours, our original analysis, part of it was in vivo, part of it was in Atlas TI, long story, don't want to get into it. And then we did this whole other thing in Word because our in vivo files and Atlas files were a mess. All of that can be done in one fell swoop. We could have done it in Atlas, we could have done it in vivo, and honestly, we could have done it in Word. We could have done all of it in Word. So I think that there's ways to build it into the process so it doesn't become quite so laborious at the end.
Excellent. Anyone have anything else to add to that? No.
Just
Okay.
among the resources I shared is a large self-guided course that we developed on managing qualitative data, and kind of this whole idea of data management and qualitative research, relatively new, but part of that idea is, you know, to make other stuff that you want to do with the data, including sharing it easier later on.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Sebastian, this question's for you, but actually it comes to Alex's point as well, I think, about making journals more involved and accountable in some ways, and our institutions. But can you comment on how journals or reviewers respond to your qualitative data? Do they ask for reproducibility? Do they evaluate transparency? Do they actively engage with the process of data collection and open science principles? Any positive, less positive experience that you could share?
Complicated question. Depends a lot on the journals. Most journals don't have much of a policy when it comes to qualitative data, transparency, etc. The biggest exception I can think of is the PLOS family of journals, which have a requirement that encompasses sharing of minimal qualitative data sets. That has some positive effects. It also means that people who publish there often come to this very late and do a hasty job. I'm a little nervous about some of the qualitative data that gets published as a consequence of that. So that doesn't always work great. PLOS doesn't do, you know, they have their mandate, they check on it, but they don't do much else. So I'm not sure if that is a great example, but there is at least a policy. In other places, reviewers sometimes react positive to it, especially because it's novel. Less the data sharing part. There's actually potential. Some people like it, some people push back, but additional transparency about methods is generally well received. That's kind of from my areas of the social sciences. But overall, if you're doing this to get better published, I don't, in all honesty, see that the current playing field justifies me telling you do open science and you'll get better. No, that's not where we are. But you know, maybe in 10 years.
Okay, great. Alex, have you got anything to add to that, or Rebecca? No? Oh, Rebecca.
Yeah, just a little bit that in at least in American journals, the open science badges, it reminds me of the Dr. Seuss book, The Star Belly Sneeches and the Stars Upon Thars. You know, it definitely helps in certain quantitative spaces. I do not see any real advantages in the qualitative American journals in which I publish to do this. And in fact, I've actually had reviewers who are very skeptical about open science and sharing basically trash my work and accuse me of unethical practices. So the paper that where we described our redaction methods was published in a very good American Methods journal. It was our second choice because the first choice journal soundly rejected it as being an unethical practice of what we did. You know, live and learn. But I think there's still a lot of curiosity, and sometimes that curiosity is judgment. So it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, a long way to go. This is a comment more than a question, but it's been upvoted, so I will read it out, being the fair chair I am. Suggest referring to quantitative research, not researchers. Many people do both, and no need to create groups or give the impression of choice or opposition. Okay, good point, well made, and thank you, Tom Webb, for saying that. Okay, so moving on to the questions. So, what is the opinion of the panel about Envivo, and I never know if I say that correctly, but anyway, Envivo and other software used for coding, and the importance, theoretical, analytical guidance for reporting? It doesn't say who that's for, so does anybody have an answer?
I have opinions.
Opinions. Well, it does say what is the opinion.
So
of the
right,
panel.
these are sometimes referred to as computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, CACDAS, which is a terrible acronym, which is why most people now call it QDAS, which is qualitative data analysis software. The downside of this is that some of the nuance gets lost because it doesn't do any analysis, right? It helps you do analysis, which is where the computer analysis part comes to, and it's very good at that, right? Well, the software is actually terrible, but almost all of it is, but it's better than doing it in like Word and trying to keep your codes straight, especially if you're working on some slightly larger projects. I would say and you do coding heavy qualitative research, which not all qualitative, but a lot of qualitative research is. I think they're pretty much indispensable. What I think is absolutely terrible is people who claim that the software is a method. And you do see this in published qualitative work. We used Envivo to analyze our qualitative data. I have no idea what that means. That's not a thing, right? Like maybe I don't know. I guess they do auto coding. Did you just press a button, or did so right, it's not a method. So there's my little rant for that. So the method comes first. You should think about, what type of qualitative data analysis am I doing? Am I doing just plain content analysis? Am I doing deep discursive thematic analysis? Do I use deductive or inductive codes to start with, et cetera, et cetera. And then you learn how to do that in your software. You find the best software to do this. To bring it back to open science, almost all of the software we have is proprietary, it's expensive, and it's not even very good for that. There is, if you're willing to be a little bit experimental, a pretty decent by now open source package called Qualcoder out there. It's a bit of a hack to install, but it is getting increasingly powerful and useful. And not just is it open source, it's also free. So it's great if you want to save costs, if you want to work with people who maybe don't have the money to invest in a $300 a year or whatever it is, license, etc. So that's the bringing back to open science.
Great, thank you. In the last few minutes as well, if any of the panelists want to answer questions directly, you can do that. We have time for a few more questions. So Rebecca, there's a question here for you. Would you go through this process again if you weren't mandated by funding requirements?
Absolutely. I wouldn't do it the same way. I wouldn't stick my head in the sand and wait till the very end and then add this, incredible extra set of coding when I was exhausted and my team was exhausted. That's the biggest lesson learned. But yeah, I was surprised and humbled at how passionate the survivors felt about having their information shared, provided that it could be protected. Which is what kept me up at night, making sure that I could protect it. But I felt like we learned a lot in doing that. So in the current work that I'm doing, we consent for data sharing. I do that a little bit differently. In my first project, it was kind of a bundled consent. You could only participate if you agreed to data share because of the funder. But now we do the tiered approach that Sebastian highlighted. No difference. Everybody's still opting in, but I've disambiguated that. And I still believe that it's important to honor what they want with their data and with their stories. So yes, absolutely would and continue to do this in my practice. I think I've adopted that, but now trying to think as we're managing the data, as we're coding the data, how we can work on the de-identification pieces along the way. We are finding a little bit of like, it's two tracks, that it's like trying to make meaning out of the data and trying to think about the identifiability risk at the same time is making our head hurt. But we are sort of, if you have kind of one person focusing on this and one person focusing on that while we're doing it, that does seem to be going quite a bit better. We use Atlas TI now for all of that, so that, because we find the learning curve is lower for that than for NVivo, and can have what we call our substantive codes, and then our methodological codes as we're going along. And it's work in progress, but it's going better. And we feel like, yeah, this is how we do things now.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to come to one last question, and I'd actually like Alex, if you could answer this as well, because Alex and I both work with people who use drugs, and some of the work that I do, I work with people who are quite cognitively impaired, and ethics boards always raise questions about, do people understand consent? Do they understand what they're consenting to? And so the question here is, can consent ever be fully informed if participants don't know how their archive data will be used and for what purposes? Participants can consent to data being archived, but is it possible for them to know how the data might be used in future and what this means? And I guess there's part of that where I'm thinking, are we making things more complicated for people to consent to, or at least some groups? So Alex, just your final thoughts on that.
It's a really interesting question, but it goes broader than that. You know, when we tell people what we're doing with their time that they give us, can we always fully inform them about everything? I'm more exercised, for example, about the fact that when I'm funded by the Home Office, I'm telling people in an informed consent form that we're doing this because it's going to contribute to knowledge. Yet I know in the back of my head that the Home Office don't like it, they're not going to publish it. In effect, I'm misleading the participants, and that troubles me. This is more about, you know, how possible is it to fully inform someone in an informed consent form? And I don't think it's ever possible to inform someone 100% of everything that might happen with their data or the risks involved in any particular encounter. So I think we have to make professional judgments with our colleagues, with our participants, about what level of information, what level of risk there is attached to giving or not giving information about it. Specifically in the archiving issue, I think we also have to give some faith to our research participants. I am always astounded by the level of paternalist risk avoidance amongst ethics boards when it comes to people who use drugs. They seem to think that anybody who uses drugs is some sort of, you know, mindless automaton that can't make any decisions for themselves. And I just think that's unethical to treat people that way. So I think we sometimes need to argue back to our ethics committees, especially when we're working with people who are stigmatized about the level of agency that they have, to say these people have agency and they have the right to make decisions about their own lives. Absolutely,
yeah. And as we've said, people often want to share. That's why they're taking part. They understand, yeah, and we should give people credit. So that's everything today. Thank you to everybody who has attended, but a special thank you to Rebecca, Sebastian and Alex. It's been a fantastic learning experience. I've got tons of notes. I saw Alex taking a lot of notes too. This will be available, and if people would like slides, we'll find ways we can share slides. I just want to let you know that we have our next webinar on the 12th of March, and that will be using analytic AI to improve behavioural research. That's part 2, and speakers include Professors Susan Mickey, Robert West and Jana Hastings, and you can register with the link that's in the chat, or you can go onto the BR UK website. Thank you all again, and thank you to the BR UK team that put this together. Lots of work goes on in the background, and they are our superstars. Have a great afternoon or rest of your morning to everybody. Thanks very much.